Hey, it's Justin Harvey. Thanks for tuning in to the Anesthesia and Pain Management Success podcast. With APM Success, we take a close look at important topics pertaining to business, practice management, personal finance, and careers for anesthesiologists and pain management physicians. We work hard to take your critical questions straight to the experts. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to another episode of Anesthesia and Pain Management Success. I'm very pleased to be joined today by two physicians. Dr. J.W. Beard is a board-certified anesthesiologist and the Chief Medical Officer of GE Healthcare, has a background clinically and has made the jump to medtech and innovation. Really excited to be speaking with him today, as well as Dr. Mo Azam, now a friend of the show, who is an accomplished anesthesiologist, innovator, healthcare strategist, works with USAP, where he is helping to shape the future of the specialty. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Justin. Thank
you. Dr. Beard, since you are new here, why don't you give us a little overview of your career up to this point and your innovative interest in the specialty of anesthesia?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And Mo, thanks for having me. So I'm an anesthesiologist, did my training at UCSF, and initially went into practice in the Sutter Health System at East Bay Anesthesiology Medical Group at Altabate Summit there in the Sutter Health System. And, you know, over the course of my career, I just became more and more involved in group activities away from the bedside. So I got involved in some of our quality assurance activities and in practice management. And it was really my practice management experience that got me exposure to hospital administration, vendor interactions, payer interactions, revenue cycle management. And I just began to develop these interests that are kind of tangential to what we're doing in the operating room. I eventually became a founder of a medical device company and recognized that was my long-term professional interest. I really like innovation and really enjoy the strategy in business and believe that innovation can really improve the lives of clinicians and patient outcomes. So when I think about, you know, some of the technologies, Mo, that were most impactful for me, you know, for me, it was video laryngoscopy and point of care ultrasound. I mean, I was going into the operating room every day, more confident I was going to secure the airway, and more confident even if someone had terrible IV access, I was going to secure a peripheral IV. And if they needed blocks or central lines, that was going to be straightforward as well. And so I'm just a real believer in technology and its ability to advance healthcare. And so moving beyond the small company that I'd founded, I got my first opportunity with a full-time opportunity with a company called Hospira, which was owned by Pfizer at the time. And I ran medical affairs within Hospira, which was then acquired by ICU Medical, until about almost 4 years ago now, and I moved from ICU Medical to GE Healthcare. And in GE Healthcare, I'm in a great spot, a great company. And for all of your listeners, Justin, it's a ton of technologies that they're going to be familiar with. So my part of GE Healthcare is essentially acute care hospital technology. So anesthesia delivery, patient monitoring, diagnostic, cardiology, maternal infant care, and we have some digital solutions that bridge all of them. And there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of really kind of interesting elements of what it takes to be successful in the med tech industry, from how you translate an idea into a product. And then perhaps even more difficult is getting it on the market, manufacturing it, and commercializing it. So it's a huge, huge leap from getting great ideas from people like Mo and his colleagues to actually getting it on the market for people to use. So it's been a good run, and I'm really pleased to have this discussion today.
So JW's got just a tiny portfolio to cover in GE there, huh?
But the good thing, Mo, is that we're all familiar with it. Yeah. You know, walking in and out of ICUs, operating rooms, labor and delivery units. I mean, it's all familiar. And so it just feels like home in some way.
I get to meet JW through Rick Dutton, our quality officer. We were both standing at a FAIR reception, the Foundation for Anesthesia Education and Research, both of our companies sponsoring it and supporting all the great work there. Started to bounce a couple of ideas off each other. Next thing I know, JW's got me pulled in with a number of other clinicians from around the country in a perioperative advisory board work group, thinking about next generation anesthesia technology. What does GE want to bring to the profession? What should they be working on, and what do clinicians really want them to be working on? And that led to a great collaboration with folks from across the spectrum, academic, private, anesthesiologists with engineering backgrounds, anesthesiologists with totally private practice backgrounds. And well, then one thing led to another, and then we've continued to iterate, given a couple of talks together. And the reason that I thought this would be a great talk is we had a talk at ASA Advance one year around what do we think innovation and anesthesia would look like 10 years in the future. And yeah, I'd love to have you pick our brains on that.
Yeah, and
Awesome.
that was not that long ago, Mo. I mean, I was looking back at that presentation. That was like January of 24, and it just feels like so much has happened since then. You know, that it all felt very early, the topics we were talking on then, and I just feel like a ton has happened.
So, as you are looking down through the corridors of the next few years, what are the developments that are in the incubation phase that you're currently most excited about?
What do you think, Mo? What about from your perspective at USAP?
You know, Justin and I were on a podcast on his show here recently, and it was sort of all the horrors of anesthesia practice, operations, and management. And it's great that we now get to talk about some of the positive stuff because I was in front of a bunch of residents with the ASA, and we were talking about what our careers have looked like and innovation we've seen in the last 20 years. And I didn't feel like there was like dramatic improvements. Yes, blocks and ultrasound and video laryngoscopy and a few things, but I actually started to do a careful inventory of what it was like when I was a resident and what it's like today. And man, there's like been dramatic changes, right? We literally had a Sears Craftsman workbench cart for our anesthesia supplies in the
Yeah,
operating room. There was no such thing as a Pyxis. There was no EMR. Um, there was automated blood pressures, but there was nothing else on the screen recording any vitals. Um, you had to scrounge for your equipment between cases and maybe steal from the other residents who were also stealing yours because we were so limited on supplies. You had to mix up your own drugs in the morning, and whether it was the pentothal or other agents, and there was no sophisticated ventilators that could do advanced modes. It was only one mode, on or off, right? And nerve blocks were mostly by landmarks. And you were guessing basically, how deep that nerve might be. And even there, I remember one of my attendings saying, prove to me that this is worth anything. Like, how is this better for the patient, right? Just put him to sleep, give him pain meds, wake him up. It's very safe and and it's effective. And so think about how far we've come there. Um, Patients had shared rooms. There were 3 or 4 patients in a room, right, with a curtain in between. Total joint spent several days in the hospital, writhing in pain. You didn't get to walking until maybe that third or fourth or fifth day. And where we are today with people going home out of an ASC that same day, right? There is no alternative to admit them. And so you have to have success. So you can't get there without tremendous quality and confidence in your outcomes. And so I think there's been tremendous innovation. I was looking at 2D echoes in the cardiology lab, M mode. Looked like squiggly lines, right? And then we were doing, of course, some TEEs. And in practice, now that's three-dimensional. and it can completely visualize the specific defects on a valve and sophisticated analysis of cardiac function and so forth. What about yourself? What have you seen in the last in your career arc?
Yeah, I mean, so I think just from the manufacturer's perspective, I think you and I are really drawn to new technology and innovation. So we're seeing, the latest and the greatest, whether it be at trade shows or, what we're seeing through our professional interactions with various companies. But I just think about like where we are in GE healthcare and our global install base and where we're like sequentially innovating. So if we just think about our patient monitoring business, I think we have millions of bedside monitors globally. Most of them are not connected to a network today. So most of them, the data just goes and then just falls off the edge of the screen. And it's not accessible again, other than at the point of care when somebody's using that data. So just the fundamental steps that we're making as a company is trying to get all the equipment onto the network so then that data can be captured. And when that data is captured, if the owner of that data, our customers, the health systems, hospitals, et cetera, if they want to keep that data and do something with it, our customers increasingly will have the opportunity to do so. And ideally that comes in all the rich context that comes from the electronic health record. And then in an interoperable environment, it's going to be the data that's coming from other equipment that's caring for that patient, even when it's not GE healthcare. So I think it's that first step, this like massive ongoing innovation is just getting equipment onto the network and then doing everything we can to integrate it, especially among vendors. Because if you go into any operating room, any ICU, it's going to be full of a bunch of different equipment from different manufacturers. And the patients don't care where it comes from. The clinicians don't care where it comes from. They just want the data to be actionable to get that person the best possible outcome. So it's this massive wave of innovation right now, which is just getting things on the network and integrating data. I'd say there's other, kind of smaller pieces of innovation that are happening. So there are, for the first time, there are, AI ML algorithms that are on the market being used to try to predict events. We've had scoring systems that exist that are driven off the health record out of numeric data that can identify a patient who may be at risk of deterioration, early warning scores, for example. But then there's more advanced technology that runs off an A line and suggests this person's at risk of hypotension. Or there's technology that identifies there's a person at risk of hypotension, you give them fluid, and how does that person respond to it? So we are getting more and more close to a state where there's going to be prediction used in the care of patients. And then we're also going to see how the patient responds to that. And that prediction is going to be refined and a little more personalized. So we're seeing those, kind of narrow applications of advanced technology, that those were related to blood pressure and fluid management. And then, of course, there's AI and ML all over healthcare literature right now, much less it's made it to the bedside less. But one of the places where it does appear to really have landed is the use of large language models and AI in kind of administrative documentation related tasks, summarization tasks, and I think increasingly in operations. I think the final frontier is the higher risk applications of AI ML, which are going to be related to patients. And that's going to be a much bigger lift.
Dr. Beard, I'm curious your perspective on the sort of the life cycle of technology from it's on a dry erase board at the top of the GE tower to we have a thing, we think it's a good idea, the engineers say it looks pretty good, Now we need to get a bunch of physicians and other, care providers in the healthcare ecosystem to actually like begin to implement something, give feedback, what's working, what's not. Are we collecting the right data? Can you just talk us through that process and how you think about that?
Yeah, and Mo alluded to this as well. He's participated in some of our advisory groups where we really look for a diverse group of perspectives to evaluate ideas, and what's going to work and what's not going to work. And we want to do that as early as possible because there's a saying in healthcare of like, manufacturers are really good at making the product right, but they're not necessarily as good at making the right product. And there's a distinction there. One is like manufacturing something to the specification and then sending it out the door. That doesn't mean it's ever going to be used. It's really trying to define that right product through those initial discussions like we have with Mo and some of his colleagues. It's like understanding like what is this unmet need? How do we potentially address it with the technology that we are equipped to design, manufacture, et cetera. And so it's getting it early. And then Justin, it's sequential. It happens over the arc of developing that particular technology solution, as we want to see it repeatedly. Everything from discussing it as a concept and putting it up on the board as like sticky notes, to having earlier we call them wireframes, or my engineering colleagues and product development colleagues call them wireframes, which is just like a visual rendering, to then prototypes, to then something that's a working prototype or production equivalent. Like it all has to keep happening because we need to be able to course correct before we get into a huge investment of bringing something to market and then either discovering too late that we've not exactly done it well, but ideally we get something to market and people love it. So it's very much sequential, and it's kind of across the product life cycle.
I understand it probably varies based on the technology, but I'm curious, who are the early adopters for we've got this shiny new thing, we think it's going to be awesome in the OR, we're going to like give it to a doctor who's going to use it on a patient for the first time ever. Like where is that happening?
So I might tease that we've actually been working together on something like this, and this is probably the first worldwide um, introduction of what we're kind of working on. It's funny, Justin, you mentioned exactly what we've done over the past year from post-it notes and dry erase boards. And we recognized mutually that one of the biggest challenges in the operating room is the ability to do early detection of patient deterioration, right? And vigilance is the profession of anesthesiology is marked by vigilance and the relentless pursuit of improving patient outcomes and safety. And we think, working together with GE, that we can help co-develop solutions that would enable ML and AI systems to augment our ability to keep an eye on everything. And there's data coming into your eyeballs as an anesthesia clinician from so many sources, right? The monitors, the waveforms, even human interactions in the operating room. And so expanded clinical surveillance, rapid decision making, basically a supercharged clinical decision support system would be something that would be really, I think, sought after by a lot of clinicians. But as we've seen out there, these AI systems are only as good as the expert training of the AI system. And if you allow garbage in, then you'll have a lot of deterioration of the models and what they call hallucinations and inexact predictions and so forth. So yeah, JW, GE Healthcare, and USAP are going to actually try to do some prototype development in this space, some product testing on using our large pool of clinicians, our clinical quality infrastructure. and GE's immense strengths in anesthesia technology, product development, AI, manufacturing, and their global footprint. But I'll let JW also comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it just needs to be a very complementary relationship. GE Healthcare has to have confidence in a problem that we're trying to address. Kind of to my earlier points, we want to believe that our clinicians do have an unmet need and that we can potentially address it. I think one of the areas that we recognize we don't have all the resources is we do have clinicians inside our company. I'm an anesthesiologist. We have other anesthesiologists in the company, intensivists, cardiologists. We have multiple people who have supported us over time. But ultimately, we just need data, and we need expert clinicians that come from, for example, Mo and his organization to support these programs as we're working to co-develop solutions and get them to the market. I think, and in terms of like who's going to adopt these, I think with Mo's leadership at USAP, like they're very much a leader in this space. And I think it starts with a culture of looking at innovation as a way to solve problems and really trying to think differently than how care has been delivered historically, what type of technologies have been used, and really trying to take advantage of the latest advances in both data analytics and model development, and then how that can effectively be brought together to bring something to the bedside that really supports decision making in a way that's timely and makes a difference for patients. So that's what we're hoping for, Mo.
Yep, it's going to be exciting to work together with many of our clinicians with a broad perspective, everything from quaternary care, cardiac, and specialized services, and a variety of different practice settings and models, right? Anything from physician only in a room to care teams. This brings to mention an interesting article that was published about a year or two ago by Rick Dutton and Dr. Scherer from UAB. It was about the infinite game. And, I think thinking outside the box is what's described in that a finite game where you've got known players, fixed rules, a defined beginning, middle, and end, and the objective is to win, right? So, in other words, thinking of things in a very structured format. I've got to, service my hospital in a, fixed model, and patients are cared for in this way that we've always taken care of patients to this idea of an infinite game, which is there aren't rules, there's no end in sight. You're here to serve patients and keep playing, right? And so, how do you define the future of care delivery when we've got constraints on workforce, when population continues to need more and more care, when significant segments of that population today are getting very different care, probably not nearly as high quality as other segments of that population that might be around advanced healthcare systems. So if there's a model that's sort of fixed in your mind about, I'm going to deliver care with an anesthesiologist in a room or 1-to-4 supervision, is that addressing all those rural markets where there's no anesthesiologist for 50 or 75 miles? Is that fair to that patient? And I think that's some of the paradigm shift we're looking at. How do you extend care and delivery to those that also need it? And now I think this is really interesting because then talking to somebody like JW who's got an international hat on, I'd love to ask that question about what you've seen elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, and Mo, I don't know if you've done, international volunteer work or not, but we certainly know from, our install base as a company, there's a whole range of resources that are available globally. And that's everything from the type of equipment that that's available, to how that equipment is maintained, to the people then who operate them, their level of training, et cetera. My experience in doing international volunteer work has really informed me about the differences in how care is delivered, and some of the both the strengths and the limitations of different groups. And ultimately, if we can get to the point where technology really starts to close the gap in this variability of bedside decisions, or closes the gap in the type of data that's being brought to that clinician to support a decision, I mean, that's going to be a huge win. When I think back about my fourth year of medical school, actually, and I worked in the National Cancer Institute in Havana, Cuba. And what an incredibly talented group of physicians, both anesthesiologists and surgeons. They didn't have access to the same technology and the same data that we would have in San Francisco. I mean, that was just the reality of their practice. And, to provide them with similar tools in the future to support, the information that they are using to make decisions, that would be incredible. It's a long road to get there globally, but, whether this is on a global scale of trying to reduce this variation across countries and markets, to, I think, even just closer to home, Mo, because you just mentioned the differences in how care is delivered in the United States. Rural, underserved areas, even within one city, there may be vastly different resources available in one hospital versus another based upon kind of various elements about how those hospitals are, what their populations they're drawing, how they're staffed, how they're funded. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity to try to reduce this variability and try to get everyone the same optimized outcome.
Justin, your wife is an anesthesiologist, right? And you're
That's
in
right.
Portland.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine 40 miles outside of Portland is probably very different care than in the city. And the same thing for myself in Orlando. We've got a hospital system that we serve, and we're doing everything from heart transplants to liver transplants to ECMO, and so forth. But 40 miles away from here is a whole different world. And the care that you can get there versus what you get here. And how is anesthesia care delivered out there? How could it be better? I think this is the kind of cool thing that technology is going to be the answer for that if we build it right. Yeah.
Something I'm curious about. I always like to understand the economic model for any business idea, particularly coming from medtech. It's one thing to say, I've got a device, I've got a CPT code, I have an indication, I have FDA approval, I have 17.4 RVUs when I put this thing in that patient, and then I bill the insurers at whatever negotiated rate, and I get paid for that. That's pretty concrete and clear in terms of the the relative complexity of what's out there. I think what you're describing sounds like a more, I'll call it abstract, probably just because I don't understand it that well, but it's more systems level. It's more like a restructuring of the existing infrastructure. And so it's the pathway to monetization, for billing, for how an anesthesia group is going to interact with this. And like, does it change how they get paid? Or for GE, they got to sell the thing so they can keep on making more things. Can you describe a little bit about with these, I'll call them like foundational technologies? Maybe it sounds like you're improving physician decision making is foundational, and that's what you're describing. But being able to turn that into somebody getting paid for doing that sounds not straightforward. So, Dr. Beard, maybe you could explain a little bit about how you process those complexities. And Dr. Azam, I welcome your input as well.
Yeah, so I just say one of the realities in med tech is that not everything is separately reimbursable. So a lot of technologies introduced to market and it just gets paid for under existing payment structures. It remains absolutely essential that particular technology is bringing incremental value and a return on investment. And that return on investments, there's clinical endpoints, there's operational endpoints, there's financial endpoints. but hospitals do not have the capital to make an investment in technology that's a nice to have. Like people are only going to invest in technologies that are going to have a return for their patients, their clinicians, their medical centers, because that's the reality that all these hospitals operate in today. And so, for us, we would want to develop a technology that we believe is going to make a meaningful change in a clinical endpoint. And so maybe it's length of stay. Maybe it's another metric that gets associated with a specific economic endpoint that kind of expands, it pairs the clinical endpoint with an economic one, then it aligns more stakeholders when a hospital is making an investment decision. So for us, it's really having confidence it's going to deliver clinical value. That's going to translate into economic value, and that it's going to align stakeholders when they're investing their limited capital. Mo, what's your approach at USAP when you guys are, advocating for these types of investments?
It's a great question. We've had, I think challenges in this space in a variety of places, and different hospital systems are very different in how they accept or are willing to bring on new technology processes, and quite frankly, things that are even obvious as improvements. I'll give you a couple examples. So Gamedex, right? I mean, pretty convincing literature, ASA's position statements and guidelines on use are fairly strong. Clinically, we all can easily see a significant benefit. Patients are reversed, paralysis is worn off, they've got stronger respiratory mechanics, less complications, even your efficiency and room turnover is faster. But there's hospital systems out there today still that put it behind a wall, right? Yeah, it's not readily available. It's not in your Pyxis. You need to have special use authorizations for it. Nerve blocks was another one. We spent years and years and years lobbying our various different hospitals and stakeholders at ASCs, at hospital inpatient facilities for support and equipment to do nerve blocks, catheters, whether it's the ultrasound, the drug, the needle, the catheter, all the above, or the nursing support that goes with it. But again, seemingly a no-brainer, right? You're sending patients home after a major orthopedic surgery same day, significantly less opioids, their satisfaction is much stronger, and yet lots of challenges there. And then the CPT code issue, as you mentioned, do we get reimbursed for our time to spend 15 extra minutes on that nerve block? Add that up to 7 or 8 cases a day if you're humming quickly in an ASC setting. And so all of these things, unfortunately, mean that adoption takes far longer than it should. And the tail wags the dog, right? The reimbursement drives the adoption and the scale of the adoption. And I think we have to be very thoughtful when we do have new technology ideas and processes of how we're going to make that convincing argument together to our hospitals and health systems to look at things holistically. The lower complications, the improved efficiency, our care teams being able to serve more patients, the hospital's throughput, their ability to actually compete against other facilities because they're offering a better service. All of those kind of go into the mix and come into the discussion around the investment that they need to make. Now, it'd be great if some of this stuff had its own CPT code and was reimbursable, whether it's a new technique or technology. But in reality, a lot of it gets bundled there.
Yeah. And I would just add, I mean, outside of separate reimbursement, outside of like convincing economics, hospitals will still do the right thing. Like when it is a technology that comes to market and it's clearly reducing adverse events, like hospitals will continue to advocate to do the right thing. One of the challenges, Mo, that I think exists in anesthesiology today is that anesthesiology exists at such a high level of safety already. So if we have a healthy patient, they're going routine surgery, the risk of adverse event there starts to kind of approach commercial aviation for having like serious injury to that patient. When you have sicker patients having bigger cases, certainly that risk goes up. But there's a very high bar for technology and anesthesia to change those more rare endpoints. Some of the technology that we've worked on with you all, which supports kind of the real-time visualization of data. Perhaps we get into the future and something that's a bit more predictive. That's going to really help in hospitals that are kind of operating their anesthesia teams at a high ratio. Maybe those people are spread out throughout the medical center. Just being able to support one another remotely, provide advice quickly over the phone if that's what's needed, kind of help anticipate things for someone who's in the room if that person is not seeing the same pattern in the data over time. I mean, those are really meaningful advances.
Justin, you asked about sort of the last 10 years and the changes, and I think care team models have evolved dramatically in that time frame. When I was in residency, I think the entire hospital system had only one or two CRNAs. Today, they have care teams up there. My practice was overwhelmingly physician-delivered care and has shifted quite significantly over the 20 years to care team models. The ICUs in the community did not have an intensivist in-house. There was maybe a pulmonary doc or an internal med doc that would cross cover and not be a specifically ICU trained. And so how has that changed? And that's a good parallel. You've got intensivists that are covering ICUs across the community with telesupervision, with advanced care practitioners on site, in-house at those locations, but the ability for that intensivist to video in, have data feeds on vital signs and monitors, can actually like pan, tilt, and zoom the camera around the room, and can augment. And so we all know that nothing can replace an expert clinician's intuition. That's eyes and ears. And in a way, could we provide that kind of support in the operating rooms? That would be really interesting, and it's probably going to take many years to get there. But I think with the changes in deep learning, machine learning, AI, and sophisticated clinical decision support integrating a lot of data points, that's a real possibility that even 2 years ago, I don't think we were talking about the way we are today.
Yeah, I think that is a great example of kind of the rapid evolution of technology in healthcare, the virtual care models. So you like just tele-critical care, that's pretty well established technology at this point. Tele-sitting, that has shown a lot of value for sitters to be able to kind of care for many patients simultaneously. Virtual primary care visits. I mean, there are just a ton of different applications of this kind of remote viewing, remote consultation. Less used in the operating room. I think for a couple of reasons, it's pretty well staffed today in terms of qualified personnel, but those personnel get stretched and really pushed to their limits pretty regularly. So it is another like great opportunity, I think, to advance the practice by leveraging some of this technology.
I'm curious, do you see what is the path to remote OR monitoring? Is there a catalyst, or is there a technology, or a couple data points that we need to be able to more reliably gather in real time? Or maybe there's some kind of like, I'm trying to think of a good example, like an event, a shortage, a critical thing that happens that we're sort of forced into. COVID is an example, I guess, of like we're now doing things orders of magnitude different than we would have ever considered just because of necessity. Can you think of possible paths for a more a more like mainstream remote OR monitoring experience?
I think that predicting the future, you'll be wrong, right? And so, but
That's what
I
makes it
think
fun.
Yeah, I think one of the cool things that JW and I are able to participate in is a lot of these health technology intensive sort of meetings and conferences. It's a little bit of a different world than our typical anesthesia meetings. And you see a lot of stuff come up and die off. And you also see folks that are raising tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to do something really ambitious. And some of that really ambitious stuff is potentially completely ambient. And there's a couple of companies that have been developing things in this space, particularly for the floors. Now, whether that comes to the operating room in some way could be interesting. So ambient systems that listen to you, look at the pattern recognition, you basically verbalize stuff instead of typing it into a computer, and it's documenting it as you go on the fly. Um, those ambient systems, as JW was saying, could do like tele-sitters, but they could also do a variety of things like a patient's getting out of bed and they shouldn't be without help. It alerts the caregivers that that's happening. You can take that and think about a variety of different use cases there. An instrument count that the cameras are watching and there's a miscount, a break in sterility, a lapse in attention on a monitor that is starting to trend, with the signs going downward before the clinician has noticed. The coverage of or augmentation of students in those settings with an extra set of hands, whether that's students or residents and so forth. You look at the ability of those systems to monitor team dynamics as a way to look at safety. And there's literally some of this being developed where it even picks up on the tone of voice. Maybe it's a difficult surgeon berating his staff into a culture of not questioning what he's doing, and that's how errors get made. All of these things, there's a lot of different startups doing a lot of interesting things, and how that gets put in eventually, and is it a unified system versus a lot of different point solutions, I think has yet to be determined.
Yeah, I think the ambient piece, Mo, that you bring up, right now a lot of it is just started with essentially the ability to capture an interaction and put a note in a chart. Like that's massively impactful for the relationship between the bedside provider and that patient. And that's probably the lightest lifting that we need in healthcare, is just to capture and document. But you're talking about what are all these other clues that exist in that environment? Is someone starting to move faster? Does someone start to look a little bit concerned? Is someone whispering to someone else in the room? Are there all of a sudden two people at the head of the bed in the operating room and they're looking at the suction canister? There's just a lot of clues that when put together may lead to an insight in the future that's going to enable a decision to be made earlier. So I
I
think there's
had
just so much interesting technology being developed.
We have a new residency program that we started in our hospital system, which was by itself pretty ambitious and great. But one of the residents had called the attending. One of my colleagues went in. As soon as he walked in the room, he immediately went to the anesthesia cart, opened the drawer, started mixing up some Levophed. And
Yeah,
the resident was like, hadn't even said a word yet, right?
yeah,
And he's like, "How did you know?" And that I think is like if you can train models and systems in
yeah,
that, right? Because 20 years of doing this is how I knew, right? And it's all of
yeah.
those subtle clues put together. And could that system, if it was in place, have helped that resident? No, yeah, of course, there's an attending already there. But I also think about it like uh, gosh, we're old, aren't we? So we had cars that didn't have analog brakes, right? And if you stomped on the brake really hard, that thing was going to skid. And remember, there was a lot of like education and driver's ed about how you pump the brakes, and that's how you make the car stop faster. From there to anti-lock brakes so that anybody could make the car stop faster. From there to the systems that go beep, 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 impending a collision From there to the system that goes beep, 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 and also hits the brakes before you crash in front of you. From there to the self-driving and autonomous, right? All of those stair steps have dramatically improved safety. And I think about some of our eh, technology and advancements in the same way.
Yeah. So we have in we're talking a lot about the operating room here, but one of our technologies, wireless wearable monitor for the med surg ward environment. One of the limitations still on many of these technologies is they alarm on thresholds, high, low heart rate, high, low oxygen, high, low oxygen. I guess we don't set an alarm for 100% saturation. So it really just only alarms for a low saturation, but they're threshold alarms. When there's an adverse event, if the record is reviewed, there's going to be some sort of trend there. And it's that identification of that trend in the context of that patient's overall condition, plus the medications they receive, plus all these additional elements. So I think, Justin, one of your questions was like, what sort of data needs to be ingested, and then some value being derived from it. So it's all of these things that I think Mo and I have highlighted with various examples that a physician in those circumstances does respond to all these different pieces of the room, of the specific elements of this patient's history, of the real-time data that may be there on the monitor, plus an awareness of recent medications being administered, what's going on in the surgical field, what's in the suction canister, et cetera. Like, it's some point, all of it's going to come together in models. That's a big lift. There's some more accessible data sets prior to that, but I think there's a lot of recognition that's where we eventually need to go.
I want to wrap up here in a minute, and I want to give each of you an opportunity to reflect on your work. And you've overseen a lot of change. You've implemented a lot of good ideas. You've probably implemented some ideas that you didn't like after you retrospected upon them. Tell me about a change that you oversaw where you observed measurable impact for the better that you're proud of.
JW?
So I think back of some of in practice, when I was helping lead an anesthesiology group, of just really identifying what was important for us to do to drive consistency in the way we were caring for our patients, working with our colleagues, and supporting our medical center. So we did some meaningful work of just rallying around. We got to get first capes in room start time straightened out. It's got to demonstrate our value to the medical center, and show our commitment to their operational priorities. Then we want to follow antibiotic guidelines, and at the time, beta blockade guidelines to the T. We want to consistently do this for our patients. We also worked the same approach when we were looking at how we did regional anesthesia for various procedures and created this predictability for our orthopedic surgical colleagues, our chest and abdominal surgery patients as well. And then a type of service that we brought to those patients in the wards with our pain management service. So there's a lot of just clinical practice initiatives that I'm really proud to have participated in. I think, in my current role, in GE Healthcare, we've got some really innovative partnerships. Mo and I are really proud of the partnership that exists between our company and USAP. And we've also introduced some really important new technologies to market in anesthesia delivery, patient monitoring, and then maternal fetal monitoring recently. And so I consider those to be big achievements for our company, and I'm proud of the role that I've played in those. Mo, what about you?
I can give a niche example that I think extrapolates to a good answer. I was the chief of liver transplant anesthesia for our hospital, and actually went to source best practices, talked to a number of the academics, and got to participate overseas in a European conference with like-minded folks, understanding technologies and techniques for bleeding management and coagulation management. And they were doing things that were probably a decade before the US. Point of care uh, coagulation testing and specific targeted therapies with factor concentrates and other agents to minimize transfusions. Made a significant difference in outcomes because you didn't give the patient liters of blood transfusions and blood product transfusions, led to overall significant improvement in surgical outcomes and was remarkable of it, but there was also a process piece of it, and there was a huge change management piece of it. So
Yeah.
bringing that back to my practice, realized, wow, I've got to now get everybody else up to speed on what I've learned and these processes that they're doing, and how do you implement that? The surgeons, the hospital, P&T, the blood bank, the point of care technology device that's going to do the coagulation testing, right? And then your colleagues and to get them up to speed. And so I think that intersection of change management, bringing new technologies is key. And it's a huge lesson learned around some of these new things that we're going to be looking forward to. And we're all looking at the new shiny stuff with AI and clinical decision support and augmented care delivery and what the future may hold. But ultimately, we've got to bring our practices, our anesthesia departments, and everyone else along with us for the ride.
Excellent. Dr. Beard, Dr. Azam, thank you very much for joining us today on APM Success.
Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Justin.
much.
If you liked what you heard this week, head on over to apmsuccess.com, where you can find more content and free resources to help you build a successful career in anesthesia and pain management. If you wanted to leave a review in iTunes, I'd also really appreciate it. Thanks for using some of your valuable time to join me today on APM Success.